And, that I can, we can deal with discounting. Again, not ideal, but you can deal with, sales can deal with the discounting. You can kind of figure that out over time. But what's more important is how do they want to pay?
Welcome to the Pricing to Win podcast. I'm your host, Farhan Mangiani. In this show, we interview pricing and competitive leaders, unpack pricing challenges, and get tactical tips for those facing similar problems today. Let's get into it. All right, Brett, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. This is awesome.
So, Brett, if you want to give a quick introduction to yourself, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, so I've been spending the last 8 years driving pricing and packaging strategies for Citrix and Fireblocks. Before that, I was an equity research analyst and a market research analyst at IDC, and I started at Citrix in the product marketing organization. So been kind of done a bunch of things throughout my career, but definitely been focusing on pricing the last nearly decade now, which is crazy.
Yeah, a decade of experience. It's amazing. And you describe yourself as full stack pricing. Can you just talk a little bit more about what that means?
Yeah. So when I think about full stack pricing, I think about there's obviously the strategy behind it, but you also need to be big into analytics and driving analytics, as most companies don't think about pricing in terms of building out their analytics strategy and operationally, right? Working very heavily with the RevOps team and how do you, strategy is great, but if you don't have the systems in place to actually implement your strategy, it doesn't do anything for you, right? And so, you think about the strategy, the implementation, operations, and then the analytics, and then obviously working with the product and product marketing team around driving value and road mapping and new product introduction. So, when you think about pricing, a lot of people, you just got to figure out what the price is. That's literally like the last step in the process. There's so many other things that come before that, and I'm sure we'll get into that, but the pricing is literally like the last thing that comes in the process. So you got to think about all these other things before you actually get to, how much should I charge?
Totally. And yes, we will definitely get into that. But right before we do, one other question I'd love to unpack with you is you've also had the pleasure of reporting into almost every function in the company, from marketing to finance to operations to product. Each one has pros and cons and different trade-offs. What's your opinion today, kind of after being around the block? Where should pricing ultimately fit and why?
Yeah. I do think ultimately it comes down to different, what the different strengths and weaknesses are of each company and where it kind of fits. And 80% of your job is going to be mostly the same regardless of where you fit. But if I had to pick one, it would be under product marketing, right? Because the reason why is that product marketing really is what drives the positioning, right? They're the people who really think about how do I position the product? How do I create that messaging? And then they're also typically involved in that MPI or new product introduction process as well in the launch process. And so between those different aspects of what product marketing does, like that has to be hand in hand with pricing, right? Like I was saying before, pricing is the last thing you do, but it all starts with positioning, right? Are you trying to be that premium brand, right? Like an Apple, or are you trying to be like that low cost competitor, like a Walmart or an Amazon, right? And depending on how you position and how you go to market, like that's going to drive your pricing strategy.
Totally makes sense. I guess how has your relationship with product marketing changed if you're reporting into a different function? Let's say something like, finance or product, let's say, right? Like product and product marketing, as an example, work very cross-functionally together, even though they report into different functions, just kind of by design. You naturally end up having really strong cross-functional relationships. What have you seen from the pricing side? Like what gets easier, what gets harder when you report into product marketing?
The biggest thing is that when I moved around between the different orgs, right, is like I'm aligning with like who is my C-suite executive sponsor, right? What do they care most about, right? And so, when you're under the CMO and product marketing, like obviously you're going to be very much aligned. But sometimes when you're under the COO or you're under the CFO, right, they might be more worried about the COGS or the operational process versus the value and positioning. So, like you said, there's always that give and take between the different pieces. And I don't think there's a more cross functional position in the company than pricing. Everyone's got an opinion, and you have to work with everybody. So it doesn't really matter. Like I said, it doesn't really matter where you sit. You have to build out those relationships across the board. But you end up with, oh, hey, this C-suite exec, is worried about the AR number. This one's worried about the COGS. This one's worried about straight through processing. Reducing sales exceptions. And so depending on who your boss or your boss's boss is, right? They're going to have different metrics tied with them, and then so hopefully you have a cross company metric that you can align with, but there's always going to be that little bit of give and take, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like having a little bit of friction in a company is actually, I think, is a good thing, as long as you can handle that well and disagree and commit. That's kind of what I've learned over my last few years, is that at the end of the day, you have to make that C-suite look good, and so sometimes you have to it's like, oh, I'd love to go focus, I'd love to do more market research with the product marketing team, but I got to really be focused on how do I operationalize this, or I got to focus on how do I reduce sales exceptions. So like I said, that's kind of where you got that give and take of like I said, 80% of the job is pretty much the same, but that last little 20% can be a lot, because again, what you're focusing on, that last 20%, can differ widely depending on where in the organization you're at.
Totally makes sense. And super interesting and very helpful, I think, to like even break it down, like you said, of like each of these execs have a different thing that they care about, maybe a different metric that they're measured on, or one that they want to measure, regardless of what they're measured on. And if you're not careful, that's going to become your metric as well. I'm curious, like, as you've gone from team to team, like, are there kind of key due diligence questions that you have for different execs to start to suss out, hey, like, what are these metrics that this person may care about? Because I'm sure even if the title is the same, right, be it maybe even it's always product marketing or always marketing, like those metrics also change from company to company, especially on the exec side. So what are some of the things that you do to kind of figure that out before you actually get there, or maybe even right after you get there?
Yeah. So when when I'm interviewing for a company, like I'm trying, if I'm looking to join your company, the things that I'm always asking about, how political is this position? Pricing can also be a very political position, whether you want it to be or not. Like I said, everyone's got an opinion about it, and so it might be, hey, this C-suite's doing it because they've got the power in the organization and they want to, they want to own it. And then over time, you might find some, things change, or that executive have left, and then like I said, then you get kind of bounced around between the different executives. But the key thing when I think about if I'm going to take a job is like, is there general alignment around the C-suite that pricing is important? Like I said, I'm not going to join a company like if they're like, hey, I just have this one exec that thinks pricing is important, and then they don't have buy-in, because you're not being set up for success in that scenario, right? It's like, hey, you can do a little bit of stuff, I'm sure, but if you just have that one person, whether it's a CFO, a CMO, like I said, unless it's a CEO, or even if it's a CEO, and they're like, hey, we want to have pricing, and you're beyond a small company, beyond 100, 200 employees, like you got to get that whole, like I said, that whole C-suite aligned that this is a very important function, and we need to make this successful, and like we need to collaborate with that person. So like that's the key thing, and the metrics. It depends on the size of the organization and where they are in their life cycle, right? Are you going to be driving new business? Are you trying to drive incremental dollars from renewals, right? Are you trying to transition from from Citrix, we went from perpetual to subscription, so there's that big transition from there. So again, depending on what stage that company is in, you're going to have different metrics that you're going to really care about and really focus around.
Got it. That makes sense. And just more tactically, I'd love to also understand is, as you're in an interview process, let's say you only meet with the CFO, and the CEO is kind of more of this is a different agenda, right? Like you don't get to really validate, you don't get to meet kind of more executives. Like in your experience, what's the best thing to do there? Like, do you like just kind of request additional meetings with the executive team? Do you ask like one executive to like kind of give you the lowdown? Like, how do you kind of validate that?
Yeah, like so you don't, depending on the size of the company, you don't need to meet with the CEO. Like if I'm interviewing with Microsoft, I'm not going to be asking to meet with such, right? But if it's you have to be meeting with a high level person in sales, high level person in product, right, high level person in revenue operations, and then and again, if you're not in the product marketing organization, someone in marketing or product marketing, right? And if you're not going through those four interviews, like that's a huge red flag for me, right? So it's like this is probably not a job that you want to take if you're not being put in front of these four different people. So yeah, so like I said, I personally probably would not take that job if they're like, oh no, you just need to meet these one or two people and you're fine, right? No, that's a huge red flag for me.
Super helpful. Always good to have a couple of those like pulse checks. So thanks for sharing some of that. Let's circle back to a little bit of the operational side that you talked about earlier, where you were saying the actual price point is one of the last things that you do, and obviously this differs, by stage. So feel free to like bring up an example if you'd like from either maybe Fireblocks or Citrix or something else, whatever you want. But like I'd love to walk through like your ideal process. What is the flow for a pricing change? Kind of what is your kind of step by step that you tend to follow?
Yeah. So great question because like I said, there's the ideal state and then there's always like the reality, right? The ideal state is you start with you always have to start with obviously a hypothesis about what you're trying to do and what you think the impact will be. But then you want to do some market research. Whether that is some in-depth interviews or like a quantitative interview. I like the conjoint surveys, when you can have the time to really think about, what are the force trade-offs that you really want to focus around. And then, so once you've got that, that research done, then you can, then you want to then review those results and then think about, how does your packaging, what do you want to do with your packaging, especially if you're in like, say, a good, better, best type of model. Like, does this feature focus, should that be in the good one to get this, get people acquiring the product right away, or do you want to put it in the better or the best, right? And so you need to think through those different um, trade-offs, right? As you think about your go-to-market strategy, and then then you want to, once you kind of have that hypothesis, you want to talk to sales, right? Whether you're a product-led growth company, whether you're a sales-led company, it doesn't really matter. Like you need to be talking to sales because they're the ones that they have to be really reinforcing the value and that value messaging and that positioning that you and that research has really come up with. And like, if that doesn't resonate with sales, they're not going to say it, right? They're not going to reiterate it. They're going to be like, whatever. And then it's going to fail, right? So it doesn't matter how good your plans are, it's going to fail. And so you got to get that feedback from sales. And then you can do some testing, right? So again, depending on the size of the company, how you test out these different offerings is going to differ a little bit. At like something like Citrix, a lot of companies, you're going to start with like a smaller country like Australia or New Zealand, where you can test out some different things that may not leak out to different parts of the rest of the world. In a more of a hyper growth startup, you're going to throw things across the board and you're going to tweak things and go fast, right? And so one of the things that we did at Fireblocks was, especially as we're going through that hyper growth phase, is like you don't have time to do all that research, right? And so you have to be, moving fast, right? And so sometimes you just have to be throwing things in there. And as much as you want great data, and that coming from a market research background, like I love to have my data. I love to, get that research going and be like, hey, this is what we heard. This is what we talked about with customers. Sometimes you just got to move fast, right? And see what happens because no matter how good your plans are, like reality is always going to be a little bit different. But you gotta have that balance, right? And so, sometimes, you know, if you just go forward with that with your testing, like it's gonna be, you can do that to a certain extent, but at some point it's gonna be like, oh hey, we didn't think through this. We kind of put ourselves in a little bit of bind because we didn't take a step back. You kind of have to like breathe out and be like, okay, this is, let's take a step back, let's do some more interviews, and let's figure this out before we start to, continue to iterate here. So it's always a balance, as in everything.
So, Brett, I'd love to like unpack that a little bit more, right? Of like in the ideal versus reality. I think it makes so much sense, right? Especially if you're in hyper growth or you got to launch like last minute, right? You need to make this change. You're just told it's happening or you got bought in late, whatever the reason, right? Sometimes you just got to roll with it. Like you said, uh, I'm curious on like the market research side is especially like at what does kind of a fast version look like in those scenarios? Like, how many data points is enough? Like, how do you know you have the right data? Or, like, kind of where are you using your intuition in those moments? And I'd love if you can maybe walk through an example where you had to rush something out the door if you have as well.
Yeah. Sorry. There's no such thing as enough data, right? As like I said, I'm a huge believer in market research, but at some point you just got to put it out there and see how it works, regardless if you have time or not, right? So when I think about, what do you need, you can get by with like 4 or 5 interviews. Now I pause and say that because I hate to give that, because that gives people license. Oh, someone said I could just need to do 5 interviews and I'm good. It's like, because I've seen that go really really bad as well, right? Um, but if you have the right people in place that really understands your competition and the value and the positioning, and you talk to those 5 customers, that gives you a great place to start, right? Like I said, just do those, and then you start to do like, okay, let's test this out, right? I love the idea of like thinking in bets. If you ever read that book by Andy Duke, like it's just like, let's just do something small, test it out, and then iterate from there, right? 'Cause then you'll start to see where some of that thing works and some of those things don't work, right? And so, um, like I said, you can start, but you want to have at least 4 or 5 interviews with customers, and that's typically what a typical manager or product marketing team is doing, anyways. But you want to make sure you're asking the right questions, because it's not just hey, is this an important thing to you? Because a lot of features are important, but are they actually willing to pay for it, right? And how is that relative to the whole bundle, right? And so you need to think about, um, how to ask those questions, because if I say, hey, how much would you pay for this feature? Like, well, either I don't know, or it's $100, or $1,000. You know, people don't really know, especially if it's a new and innovative feature. And even if they say something, you know, that doesn't take into account what procurement says or their CFO says, right? So you really need to take all of that with a grain of salt, and interpret that in the proper way, and understanding where those interviews work well, and where some of the downsides of those things are. But like I said, you don't need a huge sample size to get moving. Just enough to be like, does this work for the subset? And then, like I said, don't don't be like, hey, I heard these 5 customers say this, and then this is absolutely what's going to happen. You know, you know, as you go through the socialization process, trying to go be through that humility, and also being make sure that you have that confidence it's going to work, because you have to convince, like you said, regardless of where pricing sits, you have to convince the product team, you have to convince the marketing team, you have to convince the sales team, and then if you need to make any major changes, you got to convince the rev ops team to work through all those things. So you got to be able to balance that. Be like, hey, this is where we're heading, um, and this aligns with our long term strategy. And if you can make it align with that long term strategy, even better. So, like, even if we're wrong on this one little bit, you know, it's going to inch us closer to where we need to be.
I'm curious. There's like a big asterisk in your statement there of like 4 to 5 works if you have the right people, right? Which is
Yeah.
so important, especially as like if you have multiple products, each of those products may have their own ICP. As your product matures, that customer profile will mature over time and change, right? And you have to constantly keep up with who you're selling to versus who you're building for, right? They don't always match up. What's like, what's your way of just pressure testing? Like, do we have the right people? Like, how do you answer that question? What are you looking for?
Um, that's a great question. But like I said, it's hard to really fully answer into that. Like as a pricing person, like you typically don't have a big team regardless. So whether I think hey, that product manager is great, or I think that product manager is terrible, at some point it doesn't really matter. It's like, hey, I don't agree with this, and this is, let me list the reasons why. But let's be like, hey, if I'm going to disagree and commit, that's fine. But let's do this as a test, right? Like I said, as you go to market, it's very important to have those conversations about how broad you're going to go with it, right? And so it's like, hey, I have, especially if you have a lot of doubts about something, you'd be like, okay, I have a lot of doubts about this, but I agree that I don't have any data to say one way or the other. So let's put it in the market, but let's look at this as a test, right? And that we're going to do an experiment, and after a certain period of time, whether that's 3 months, 6 months, like we're going to have enough data, and we're going to say, hey, we're going to make a change. And so you need to have, going back to your question about like what are good questions to ask for like the executive teams, like how do you think about failure in an organization? Like, how do you think about thinking of bets? It's like there are sometimes when you do a product launch and some organizations are like, it has to be a success or you're going to get fired, right? And like and if that's the case, and in pricing where you don't have control over many parts of what you need to go to launch, like I said, that's another red flag.
That's a great proxy of like what happens if a product launch fails. Do you care about the lessons learned, or is it like success or nothing, right? That's a great, I love that question. On the other side, again, like a little bit more tactical, is willingness to pay. I also love that you called out, hey, you don't literally ask like what dollar amount are you are you willing to pay, right? And people approach this different ways. If you're doing a survey, then you can kind of get this range, and there's multiple ways to do that. If you're in a live interview, right, there's different ways you can approach this question. I'm happy to share a couple that I've seen, heard, and used, but I'd love your opinion. Like, is there like a go-to question you have to gauge willingness to pay?
Um, like you can't just do one question. You have to do like three or four different questions. Like the most common one that I've seen out there is like it's called the Van Westendorf, right? It's like what's the max, what's the min, and it's like three or four different questions, and it kind of helps you triangulate. Like I said, it's a good data point. Like I said, I look at it as like that's a great data point. But one thing I didn't really talk about so far is that what's even more important than the willingness to pay is how you want to pay, right? Like I said, if you're in a mature market, that's usually pretty straightforward. You already know what it is. But in this market that's constantly changing, even at Citrix that had been around 20, 25 years, right? You have the cloud, and you start to see that people wanting consumption, right? That's a huge change, right? Between, hey, I want perpetual, do I want a subscription, do I want consumption, do I want a hybrid? Like that is way more important than the actual dollars, what they're willing to pay. Because like the like I talked about before, is like pricing is the last thing, and that I can we can deal with discounting. Again, not ideal, but you can deal with sales can deal with the discounting. You can kind of figure that out over time. But what's more important is how do they want to pay? Because not only does that drive a higher willingness to pay. I think like they'd be more willing to pay more if they can get consumption or they don't have to commit, right? Versus they don't have to do a long term commitment. But it also has a huge effect on your go to market strategy, a huge effect on your operations. So how customers want to pay is a lot harder to change. Your systems and your people and your processes than just changing the price or the packaging, right? So like that is, to me, like I said, you want to understand like what is that willingness to pay, but first and foremost, like, how do you want to pay? And understanding, the hardest thing is, if you're a startup, is what is that proper value metric, right? Especially if you're trying to do a hybrid model or a consumption model, you need to have a value metric that aligns with the customer's, business model. And sometimes it's easy and straightforward, and sometimes it's like, you know, it's completely irrelevant. How we can actually measure this in our product is going to be completely different than how the customers want to pay. So that's the other part of the equation, is like, yeah, they want to pay this way, but the product doesn't actually have the telemetry to actually measure it that way. So you can't actually implement that. So how do you come up with like that, good compromise of, that right value metric? So like I said, it's about how customers want to pay, aligning that value metric, and then getting into, that willingness to pay discussion.
Super important call out. I love that trade off, right? Such a helpful mental model of, yeah, worst situation, you get your price point wrong, you can address with discounting. It's, yeah, not the best thing in the world. You definitely want to keep an eye on that, especially as you mature. But like, you can get around it. If someone wants a totally different billing method, or they want to be, like you said, measured on something that your product can't track today for whatever reason, that's a ton of friction, right? It's like pretty hard to even work around that manually. And maybe you can make a one or two exceptions here and there, but you can't really do that at scale. I also love that you talked about the people part, right? Because in an ideal world, right, if you have strong alignment on the sales and sales leadership side, this is even influencing who you hire, right? People familiar with that motion, who understand how this works, right? So it's not a huge shock to them in the selling motion, right? There's not that loss of productivity, et cetera, et cetera. So super helpful call out. I love that you shared that. I know we talked about like a lot of different buckets of pricing so far, and you shared that most pricing folks are one person show, maybe like a couple of people, right? You got an analyst, maybe you got someone mid senior level, and then maybe the person you're reporting to also has some pricing experience, but at the earliest stage, more than likely not, right? They're trying to fire themselves from doing pricing, and that's why they hired you to go figure it out. And so when you think about like all the different buckets that you just talked about, right? On one side, you have the strategy that you mentioned of like, well, what makes sense? Are we going to be the low cost provider? Are we going to be a premium provider? Then you have the actual articulation of that, right? How are you positioning yourself? Which you can only really understand if you have delved into the competition and you understand the alternatives. Then there's like the cost side, like all these different buckets that you need to have like some understanding of. Now, whether you're doing this or you're relying on your partners in product or finance or wherever, like how do you think about like how to spend your time? Like how does that differ by, let's say, stage? Maybe you can contrast that for us. If Fireblocks was like a much earlier stage when you joined, or a much less mature market, for example, in the crypto space versus Citrix or something else. How do you decide where to spend time?
Yeah, I mean, so like I said, it really depends on like what you have in that organization, right? So like, you know, I'd say the first few months at Fireblocks, that we were still building out the team, across the board. We were going through hypergrowth, so we didn't have much competitive information, competitive team. But by the end of my first year there, we had this fantastic competitive team. Like that took a lot of pressure off of me to be like, hey, I can just go ask them questions. I don't need to go and spend a lot of my time on that, right? On the flip side, like COGS is always important. But again, as you're scaling out, right, you have, as any startup is, you're going to have a lot higher costs up front as you're trying to build out the infrastructure. Even if it's a cloud infrastructure, right, you still have to build that out. And then, so you want to think about what is that long term, what steady state COGS are going to be. And so you work with your FP&A team and kind of figure out, make some assumptions, and every few months or every year you're going to tweak those. So where I feel like I can make the most biggest bang for my buck is really around that value leg of the stool, right? And so when you talk about value, there's so much that goes into it, like you just talked about, the competitive alternatives, how you're positioning it, how you're going to market, right? That all goes into that value bucket. And so that's where I typically spend a lot of my time. And then operationally, like at a startup, like I said, depending on the type of skills that you have a pricing person, and this type of skills like your revenue operations team might have, like I said, it's going to be a bit of balance. Like you said, um, your strategy is great, but if you don't have the systems in place, and so sometimes you just kind of have to be like, okay, what am I going to do to kind of tweak this to meet my RevOps team where we're at today? Because again, you want to launch something off the ground. Like, okay, I may not be able to do like say a true consumption offering today, but maybe I could do a hybrid offering, or maybe I could do something else, right? What are the different tweaks? And so you need to always think about those different trade offs. But really, like I said, I like to spend a good amount of my time around understanding what the value is, what the value proposition is, and like you said, with the ICPs, that changes over time. Like it says, as the market changes, especially at your early stage startup, you're going to have your ICP is going to change quite a bit, or you might be like, hey, I want to go from one or two or three ICPs to now 7 or 8 different ICPs because now we're introducing new product, right? So then you have to take all those different things into account. So, like I said, it's a lot of different information. The more data you get, the better. But like I said, at some point you just have to make a decision. What I've really realized over my career is that there's no such thing as great data. Like, the best you can hope for is good data. So you just try to hope that you get good enough data.
Just need good data. And then the rest is, I'm sure, like intuition and experience, right? Which is where what makes you even more valuable of like been there, done that a little bit, right? You have some sense of an idea. And then, like you said, at the end of the day, you're just testing that hypothesis, right? So if you don't have high confidence in it, roll it out in a smaller way, right? Maybe in some sort of pilot, beta, whatever you want to call it, however you want to operationalize it. And if you do have that confidence, then go ahead and just make the full blown change. Super helpful. I love that this concept of like this belief, right? Of like, hey, there's not any great data, right? Especially coming from a market research background. You're just gonna find good data. Are there other strongly held beliefs that you have around pricing that have kind of stayed with you from organization to organization?
The biggest one that's really hard to do is get involved earlier in the new product introduction process, right? It's as whether it was at Citrix where I was transforming and being the first head of pricing there at the company and trying to transform how the company works together, or at a early stage startup, hypergrowth that's going really fast. It's like, how do you get involved in that product with the product team to be earlier in that process, being like, great, you have this great idea. I'm not trying to say that your idea is good or bad. What I'm trying to understand is, are customers willing to pay for that? Because like I said, there are some times where it's table stakes, like, take like SSO, like, depending on if you're an enterprise B2B, like SSO is huge, sometimes, there's people will charge a premium for that, put that in their, enterprise package or whatnot. But, you have to do that. Like, that's not something that you necessarily need to really do a lot of research around. But then there are things that, what are the other key indicators around customers willing to pay? Like we talked about earlier, doing some of that research up front and building that business case. When I talk to the product team, I'm like, yes, we're a venture capital funded company, but as you think through every major feature that you're coming through, think about that as, hey, you're going to the executive team. They have a board that they need to say, hey, I'm spending these resources on these features because, it's going to give us, X ROI, right? And so you need to think, as a product manager, you need to think about the same way, right? What is that ROI? Are you driving up revenue? Are you driving up retention? Right? Are you driving, just making sure it's a competitive play so that we reduce, losses? What is that key value metric, or sorry, that key KPI that you're looking for? you think about all of those things as an investment, and and that the executive team is basically your VC, that you're pitching to and being like, hey, this is what we think is going to be a huge make a huge impact on our roadmap.
If you're working with a product team that is less familiar with the pricing process, right? For them in the past, maybe they didn't have a pricing person. So it is literally, yeah, let's just decide the price point, and then do we want some packaging, good, better, best, and cool, we're done. How do you like convince them to bring you on earlier in the process, right? Maybe imagine you're in the situation where things are being thrown over the fence constantly to you, right? You find out about the release, a couple of weeks in advance, and you're just like, man, like I need to get everyone better educated about what is the value that you can bring at the earlier stage. What are some of those like talking points?
Um, so that brings up like a story that when I first took over pricing at Citrix, I did a bit of like a world tour, because we had product teams kind of all over the country, and I was going through the different product teams, and I was going to present, why pricing important, why I'm important, and before I just had one slide up, and before I was waiting for people to pour in, and one more of the senior leaders comes in, and I don't know if I can swear on this podcast or not, but she literally is like, "Who the f- are you, and why should I care?" And whoa, it's like I haven't even started yet, but well, that was a bit of a smack in the face of doing that presentation. It's a great lesson. Like as I think about it, you know whatever my first intro to a person is, it's like, who the fuck am I, right? What are my credentials? What have I done? What are my wins? What are my losses? And then why should you care? It's like, well, let me help you. Like, let me help you do this and make your launch successful. Like, that's what I'm here to do. Is like, I'm not here to be confrontational. I'm not here to take over a bunch of different things from you. I'm here to take some of that pricing off of you, but you're that product expert. You know those customers better than I do. Like, I'm going to rely on you to give me a lot of that intuition and a lot of that feedback. And so, like I said, it's the great lesson I learned from that is like, I just literally need to be like, understand, go into a room. This is who I am. This is what I can do for you. Let's work on this collaboratively, and then go into here are the different pricing frameworks and a lot of that detailed stuff that we get into. But you can't even get into the details until you start to build up some credibility with that team. And so, like I said, hard lesson learned, but it was a good lesson to learn.
I love that. So helpful, right? Like a phrase that I often use is I'm not the approver, right? Like you don't need to you don't need to seek my permission. It's ultimately up to the CEO, right? They can do whatever they want with this pricing decision, but we can help operationalize your hypothesis, right? And it will be your hypothesis at the end of the day, right? And I love that you mentioned before, right? Like even if you disagree, you are willing to disagree and commit, but then you're going to build out the basically testing ground for this to see, right? Maybe your intuition tells you it won't work, but like that doesn't mean you won't help them, right? You are there to help at the end of the day. I think it makes a ton of sense, and in my experience, it would definitely resonate with product. I'd love to ask about the opposite as well. Something that maybe was strongly held, but you've changed your mind about, either recently or maybe long ago. Anything come to mind there?
Really, the two data points that we talked about before, like doing the market research, like again, coming from that market research background, as a big believer, you got to do a ton of research before you go out to market, and having great data. Like I said, it's with experience, you realize having like I said, you always want to do some research, and I always think you never get enough research budget. So like that is still true, but when you're trying to move fast, you can just go to market, like, and make sure that you've done enough research. You get, as long as you get alignment, right? The big thing is you get alignment from everybody, and like, hey, this is what we're going to do, and we're all going to try to make this successful. And if we fail, like I said, we'll iterate, and that's fine. But we all want to be agreed that this is what we're going to go move forward with. And like I said, So you don't need to do a ton of research, but if you can, like you said, ideally you do. And then data, like I said, whether it's market research data or internal data, most of the what you'll find, especially if you're building out a pricing team for the first time inside a company, whether it's an early stage startup or a legacy company, it's been around a long time. Most of the data is built for revenue and accounting and maybe product telemetry. So like just understanding like, hey, they bought X quantity for Y dollars, like that data doesn't always exist inside your systems. That's crazy as it sounds, but because of revenue recognition rules and everything, that's all sitting in their ERP. It all gets kind of spliced and diced a bunch of different ways. So you need to go back and kind of figure out, how do I put that data back together to kind of get that and be like, okay, I've got 60, 70% confidence in this data. I know what my error rate's going to be, but now I've got enough data, like I said, good enough data to move forward with a hypothesis. And like I said, it's as long as you've got enough of that and you make people aware, like, hey, I'm not going to be able to get all the data. It's just, between time, or, hey, if you want to spend $100,000 on a data project, let's go do that. But, most of the time, you're not going to get the approval for that. So, like I said, it's just go forward with that good data and just move forward.
Yes. And it goes back to your point about alignment, right? If you already have the alignment, that this is a big experiment, and that is the pricing process, right? It's just experiment, launch, get feedback, iterate, right? Then it should be fine, right? To make these decisions on little to no data. And then going back to your even earlier point, that sounds like a great question to be able to validate when you're first interviewing, right? Of like, how much data do you typically need or get? To make kind of big company decisions, and just understand that historically, and using kind of product launches as a proxy there of like, have you ever done a product launch with like little to no data? What did that look like, right? And the answer is probably like, oh yeah, all of them. It's all a big guess at the end of the day. I love that. All right, so we've come down to our rapid fire round. 3 questions, just kind of quick off the tongue here of what immediately comes to mind. First question, any tactical tips for folks who are starting to get into pricing or facing some similar challenges that we've talked about today?
Yeah. Like I said, go talk to your sales team, right? If you're just getting in, they'll tell you what things are working, what things are not working. Like just talk to them, get their feedback. Like that's a great place to start, if you're just starting to, get into that pricing role.
All right. Any resources for folks just starting off? Just starting to own pricing for the first time, right? Still trying to figure out value and competition and research. Like any resources you'd recommend to get started?
Yeah. You can never go wrong with monetizing innovation, right? Written by the Simon Kucher Partners team. Like, they're the world recognized, pricing partners, pricing consultants. And there are other ones out there, but they're the ones that are most recognizable. I also like Kyle Poyer's, Growth Unhinged newsletter. That's always get some good tidbits there. And then if you're into product led growth, there's a whole bunch of people out there that are now talking about the go to market strategy with PLG, and a little bit of how pricing falls into that. Like Elena, and I'm blanking out her name, and Leah. Like I know the first names, but I can't remember the last names. But they're on LinkedIn, they're on Twitter. You'll be able to find those things. So those are all great resources to start with.
Awesome. And I'll get the names from you, and I'll link it in the show notes for everyone. We'll link out to their LinkedIns or Twitters, or maybe both. And if folks, something resonated with folks, right? They want to dig in with you about something that you talked about today. What's the best way to reach out?
I'm more on LinkedIn today. So like I said, I'll send you my LinkedIn profile. Still on Twitter a little bit, but not as much as I used to be. So, but either way, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn or Twitter.
All right. Amazing. And any kind of last plugs or promotions for yourself, something fun side project that you're working on, or anything else that you want to share before we wrap up today?
No, not at the moment, but I appreciate that. This has been an awesome interview, and you know, this is hopefully we'll come back in a little while and then we'll do another one and continue it. So this is awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. This is a great conversation. Thanks, Brett. Thanks for listening to the Pricing to Win podcast. Remember to follow and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We'll see you next time.